You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 17th of May 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. Coming up on today's programme, the American-built pier off Gaza begins delivering aid. Also ahead, it's kicking off again in Taiwan's legendarily unruly parliament as a new president prepares for inauguration. Later in the show, we'll wrap up the latest business news and review some new cinema releases, and we'll look at why Hungary's Prime Minister is taking personally the attempted assassination of Slovakia's Prime Minister. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And welcome to today's edition of The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. The first delivery of aid for Gaza has rolled off the temporary pier built in recent weeks by the US military. US Central Command was careful to confirm that no American soldiers went ashore. The actual delivery of the aid will be supervised by the World Food Programme of the United Nations. In related developments, hearings are continuing at the International Court of Justice into a case brought by South Africa in a bid to force Israel to abandon its assault on Rafah in the south of the Gaza Strip. Well, I'm joined with more on this by Paul Rogers, international security expert at Open Democracy. Paul, first of all, the opening of the pier, how significant a moment is that?
Well, it is an extraordinary development. You have a very large sort of offshore platform about 3 miles offshore, and that's where the stuff comes off very big merchant ships and is transported to smaller army ships. They then go 3 miles towards the shore, and then there's a smaller sort of pier which runs, I think, third to half a mile to the shore itself. So you only have trucks actually going onto shore and then coming off almost immediately when they're unloaded. And it is believed, although I'm not sure, that even there are not American troops driving those trucks. In fact, there was one report that the British are going to drive them. So essentially, this idea of not having any Americans going ashore is probably being carried out. The complications are huge. It's known as, the Joint Logistics Over the Sea system, JLOTS. And this particular endeavour is going to cost about $250 million. So it doesn't come cheap. Whether it is hugely significant all depends, because once you have the aid ashore, it is then essentially the responsibility of international organizations to distribute it under the eyes of the Israeli defense people. So the Israelis basically have control from the point that it comes ashore. And at the moment, the UN is reporting massive shortages of fuel to even ship the stuff around. And what's a further complication is that in the southern part of Gaza, you have an ongoing war, a very bitter ground war involving the Israeli troops going into parts of Rafah. So overall, the thing is probably going to work in a limited way. The extraordinary thing is two different aspects. One is all this could be done far cheaper using the Israeli port of Ashdod, which is just a few miles up the coast from Gaza. But the Israelis are not prepared to do that. And the other thing, of course, is that while this is going ahead at considerable cost to the United States is also providing the weapons to carry on with the war. So it's a very weird situation. The problem, of course, for Biden is that he has to look to two completely different constituencies in the United States. The people, particularly on the Democrat side, who are increasingly concerned about the loss of civilian life in Gaza, and the many people who support Israel, particularly the large Christian Zionist community. So basically, he's trying to do two things at the same time. And who can say whether it will work? But the point is, of course, it comes back to what you were saying at the start, the meeting in the International Criminal Court, about whether the Israelis are actually breaking international law and what they're doing. They deny this very strongly, but there are many countries that are very dubious about those denials.
Well, let's take a look at that case before the ICJ. Does the ICJ actually, in theory, have the power to order Israel to stop its assault on Rafah or indeed to do anything else?
Well, that's the point. Does it have the power to do anything? I mean, basically, it can be ignored. I mean, this particular court, if I'm right, the Israelis are not actually members of it. And I don't think the United States is. I don't think they've even joined. Now, they will deal with this. And obviously, they put representation in today to demand to really do their case. It's very much a question of international opinion on these things. And one suspects that, in fact, it is still moving pretty strongly against Israel. There's been a report that all G7 countries, apart from the United States, along with Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, have sent a letter, a joint letter to the Israeli government saying really hold back on Rafah. Now, that is very strong pressure in a way, but of course it is the United States that really holds the reins in this one. And for the moment, there doesn't seem to be any change there. So I know a rambling answer to what you're asking, but the point is, in a sense, the International Criminal Court is significant politically and internationally. But when push comes to shove, the Israelis could just go their own way. And there are considerable fears, I think, across not just the Western world, but the global world, that they will do this anyway. And that all depends really on changes in the American attitude.
Well, if there is a way then to weave these two threads together, is it possible to look at the establishment of the aid delivery pier by the US military as something of a diplomatic rebuke to Israel? Because as you correctly point out, there are any number of ways that it would be easier to ship aid into Gaza. Is this the US, or has it been all along, the US being able and willing to spend the amount of money necessary to say, OK, well, if you're not going to help, we'll do it ourselves?
I think it's a good argument, that, and it's very difficult to tell what is inside the White House thinking. I suppose what it really means is if this aid starts to flow in a reasonably serious way, but the Israelis still go heavily into Rafah, then essentially that is when it looks not so easy for Biden. If, though, it becomes an added pressure on Netanyahu, then I think that becomes significant. There is one other point to make. As far as we know, all the aid is going ashore fairly well south of Gaza City. And there's this strategic road which the Israelis have constructed almost to cut off north from South Gaza. And that means that the very difficult areas where there is really, we're verging on famine in the north, is not easily reached from this new pier unless the Israeli armies are prepared to allow it. So we really don't know where that is going to happen. So overall, there are a number of imponderables. But going back to your point, it is probably the case that Biden is at least showing, look, Netanyahu, this is what we mean. But the point here is that he could actually stop the war more or less overnight, but just saying no more heavy bombs and the rest. But then he has his domestic constituents to consider, and that, I think, is what's holding him back.
Paul Rogers, thank you, as always, for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing. Here is Mariella Bevan with the day's other headlines.
Thanks, Andrew. Russian President Vladimir Putin ends his two-day visit to China today. After sealing pledges of a new era of strategic partnership with China's Xi Jinping, Putin has highlighted the growing importance of trade near the Russian border in China's northeast. Facing political isolation over the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Putin is increasingly turning to China to support its war economy. France has declared a state of emergency on the island of New Caledonia. Rioters angry with an electoral reform have burnt businesses, torched cars, looted shops and set up road barricades over 3 days, cutting off access to medicine and food, authorities said. French police reinforcements have started arriving as part of a massive operation to regain control of the capital of Nouméa. And Moldova will hold a referendum in October on European Union membership, the cornerstone of President Maia Sandu's policies. Sandu singles out Russia and corruption as the biggest threats to the sovereignty of the country lying between Ukraine and Romania. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Mariella. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Time now to take a quick look at the latest business headlines with Bloomberg's Ewan Potts. Ewan Potts at Bloomberg. Story we covered earlier in the week, Ewan. China unleashing further stimulus, trying to prop up its housing market. There are any numbers of examples from history of this not going tremendously well?
Yeah, Andrew, it's 3 years now since China placed restrictions on developer debt. Collectively, they've defaulted on more than $120 billion since then. There is huge amounts of unsold inventory across China, flats half built, flats fully built and not sold. It is a massive problem for the Chinese economy, and it's causing a lot of unease amongst ordinary people in China, and that is holding back consumer spending and the housing market itself. Well, we'll be getting more details today from Beijing on their plans for addressing this problem. They've been doing a number of measures over the last couple of years, but they really seem to be going for it now. They've said that they're going to advance $42 billion of central bank funding to help government-backed firms to buy excess inventory from developers. The plan is to then convert them into affordable housing. And separately, another measure hoping to instill confidence in the housing market. They've cut the minimum down payment ratio, aka deposits needed for buying homes for first-time buyers, from 20% to 15%, and for second homes from 30% to 25%. So making it a little bit easier for people to buy houses. But the problem is that a lot of people are just not out there in the market because they're really anxious about the state of the market. We know, of course, that the property sector is hugely important for the Chinese economy. And some interesting data today on that wider economy. It does seem that the world's second biggest economy is undergoing something of an unbalanced recovery. We had 2 bits of data. Growth in consumer spending unexpectedly cooled to just under 2.5% last month. That was the slowest pace since 2022. There is not a lot of consumer confidence out there, and that is partly because of that property crisis. But China's factories are going great guns. Output rose by faster than expected, 6.5% last month. So China's factories, and a lot of that is for exports, seem to be doing it pretty well. And that's despite manufacturing being quite slow in many parts of the world. But China's factories seem to be humming along quite nicely.
Less ambiguous or less equivocal news for Vietnam, where there is something of a boom ongoing, record investment pouring in.
Yeah, over the past few years, there's been quite a lot of political unrest in Vietnam. They've been undergoing an anti-graft drive. It's taken down a string of top Communist Party officials, including presidents, deputy prime ministers and Politburo members. But none of that has been putting off investors. The first 4 months of this year saw foreign direct investment rise by 7.5%. That was after a record year last year. It topped $23 billion. It's become a very, very attractive destination, particularly for chip makers and some of the tech firms in the US and elsewhere. The IMF reckons that Vietnam's economy will be among the very fastest growing in Asia this year. And next year it will lead alongside India. Now, the country benefits from a few things: an expanding economy and a growing middle class, and a real growing role in the global electronics supply chain. It's managed to play its hand rather cleverly, balancing ties between the US and China. Presidents Joe Biden and Xi Jinping both visited Vietnam last year within months of each other. The country has managed to maintain healthy relations with both sides, and a lot of big companies are investing in Vietnam as a cheap manufacturing hub, and one which is so far fairly insulated from those political worries.
Ewan Potts, thank you for joining us. That was Ewan Potts at Bloomberg. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. Taiwan's famously rumbustious parliamentarians have been at it again. The latest outbreak of fisticuffs on the floor of the Legislative Yuan appears to have been occasioned by opposition proposals to give Parliament greater power to scrutinise the government, up to and including bringing criminal charges against officials deemed to have misled the Parliament. The spectacle, while undignified, does at least serve as a reminder to incoming President Lai Ching-te, due to be inaugurated on Monday, of the difficulties his Democratic Progressive Party will face, having lost their parliamentary majority even as he won the presidency. Well, I'm joined with more by William Yang, a journalist based in Taipei and Monocle Radio regular. William, for connoisseurs of punch-ups in Taiwan's parliament, where did this one rank in the pantheon?
So basically, today's conflict in the legislature and the battle for trying to pass that opposition proposal is in fact one of the very important, I think, development because, as you said, this is the first time that the main opposition party here has regained control of the legislature. So they're really trying to showcase to the public and use this very hard-earned majority and the power to try to compromise or to try to challenge the government. So, like this bill, they're trying to rush it through the parliament before the inauguration to, in my opinion, show the incoming administration that there is a lot of leverage that the opposition parties can use in the legislature to actually counter the policies or the directions or proposals that they consider as that is very harmful or potentially not in Taiwan's interest.
What is the DPP's objection to these proposals? Isn't scrutinising the government the sort of thing Parliament's supposed to do?
So their argument is that the details of the proposal from the opposition basically has violated Taiwan's constitution. And because the constitution, in their opinion, does not require the president to need to deliver the State of the Union to the parliament. And at the same time, also, they worry that this is basically expanding the parliament's ability to, in their own words, obstruct the government's actual function and also putting forward implementing policies.
Is it going to be difficult in general? And I guess, is this punch up an indication of how difficult it is going to be for the DPP to actually do any governing?
Yes, that is in fact the worry among most experts here, because they felt like the last 3 months has already shown that the two opposition parties in the legislature, which adding together all their seats, they do have a majority. They have been showing that they have abilities and the, shared goals to actually work together on certain issues to try to stop the ruling party to push forward the agenda that is preferred by them. And some of those agenda are in fact being viewed as harmful to potential cross-strait relations and the exchanges with China. So I think this is a foreshadowing of what we are very likely going to see going forward for the next 4 years in Taiwan.
Well, we are looking forward to an inauguration of the new president on Monday. What are we expecting from his first term?
I think the very important thing that we will be looking at on Monday is how he frames his government and administration's approach towards China, because we know over the last 8 years, China has cut off all official communication with Taipei. And in recent years, since 2022, we are seeing a very concerning uptick of Chinese military pressure on Taiwan. So how his government is going to send a signal that will be considered as a goodwill by Beijing is going to be definitely at top of the agenda for him. But at the same time, a very difficult task for him to balance, because we are seeing China more and more using different ways that are under the threshold of actual military invasion or actual military attack to threaten and also intimidate Taiwan. And it's really putting Taiwan at a place where they are struggling to find very effective ways to respond to. So how his government is going to address these challenges, but at the same time make sure that Beijing is going to start considering maybe lowering the level of pressure on Taiwan, will be definitely, I think, putting his government under a lot of pressure just going into their first term or even just the first few months.
But has he signalled at all that he has any desire to change, alter, even remake the relationship with Beijing, or is he basically just hoping that it will stay more or less as it is?
So I think he has repeatedly mentioned that he is willing and open to dialogue with Beijing under the condition that both sides are being treated equally. But obviously, that is the condition that Beijing will never accept. So what we have seen over the last 8 years is that the conditions about whether to open or grant Taipei the luxury of having the ability to have dialogue or conversation with Beijing is always controlled by the Chinese government. So in fact, his government and himself knows very well that they're coming into power without much agency to actually set the tones or set the conditions for restarting any sort of cross-strait dialogue. And at the same time, the Chinese government is really trying to exploit the divisions within Taiwan's political scene by courting these more China-friendly opposition parties so that they can use these opposition parties to put pressure on the government without directly being accused by the international community for interfering in Taiwan's domestic politics.
William Yang in Taipei, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio.
Monocle's blueprint for a smartly designed world is here. The May issue contains our annual Monocle Design Awards, showcasing the 50 finest studios, architects and projects to benchmark. Alongside the winners, here are 3 other stories not to miss in this month's magazine. Bengaluru is booming. In a key election year for India, we make for the city touted as its answer to Silicon Valley, to understand how its strengths and contradictions will play out as the world's most populous nation heads to the polls. Athens' retail revival. The Greek capital isn't just somewhere to stop off en route to the islands. Athens now hosts HQs for emerging brands and beautiful boutiques that are making a case for brick-and-mortar retail in the age of e-commerce. Tokyo steps up to the plate. Asbadai Hills Market serves everything from just netted fish to farm-fresh meat and vegetables. This isn't just a handsome case for mixed-use developments in the heart of a city, but also a canny business model for offering restaurant-quality ingredients to hungry customers. Save room for the latest issue of Monocle and pick up a copy at your favourite newsstand or our website. Or, better yet, subscribe today at monocle.com/subscribe so you never miss a helping. Bon appetit!
You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. In Slovakia, Prime Minister Robert Fico is reported to be in a serious but stable condition following an assassination attempt on Wednesday. Fico was wounded several times in the shooting, for which a man has been charged with attempted murder. All European leaders have issued proper expressions of condemnation and concern, but few have seemed more perturbed than Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, one of a small number of European leaders actually politically sympathetic to Fico. Orbán has fretted out loud that the attack on Fico leaves him isolated. He called it a major loss for Hungary. Well, joining me for more on this is AP's Hungary correspondent based in Budapest, Justin Spike. Justin, welcome back to the show. Unless Orbán has been uncharitably translated here, isn't this Orbán making this a bit all about him?
Thanks for having me back. I think that for Prime Minister Orbán, as he's gearing up with this campaign for European Parliament elections, he genuinely does see the shooting of Prime Minister Fico as a loss for him and for his party. There are also municipal elections in Hungary on the same day as the European Parliament elections, but Orbán and his Fidesz party have largely left those alone, and it seems that they're really preparing primarily for the European election. Orbán has cast the election as a simple choice between war and peace. He's portrayed himself as being the only pro-peace leader in Europe. Charged the European Union with being warmongering for supporting Ukraine after Russia's full-scale invasion, and I think he saw Fico as an ally in this attempt to try to steer Europe in a different direction, to cease providing military aid to Ukraine and to force Russia and Ukraine to the bargaining table to bring an end to the war.
I mean, but is this not Orbán attempting to co-opt the shooting of Fico into what is by now his own familiar narrative of persecution by larger and or furtive powers?
Well, in his interview on state radio this morning, he certainly did seem to state as a matter of fact that the alleged shooter was a pro-war, pro-Ukraine left-wing activist of some kind, which is by no means something that has been confirmed at all in the press or by Slovak authorities, who have essentially written out a news embargo on any information related to the investigation. So I think Prime Minister Orbán portraying it as a fact that that he's aware of the identity or the political affiliations of the alleged gunman shows that he is keen to try to use this tragic event as some sort of political bargaining chip, or use it to his political advantage.
I mean, is Orban actually a bit nervous about these upcoming elections? He does face a new opposition figurehead, I guess, Peter Magyar.
Yes, recent polls seem to suggest that Orban's Fidesz party is likely to lose seats in the European Parliament after these next elections. Some polls show that his voting base has shrunk by around 1 million people, which is really significant in a country of fewer than 10 million people. And a lot of that is due to the rise of this Peter Magyar, who was a former insider within Orban's party, but in February sort of broke ranks and came out and began accusing Orban and his government of essentially autocratic tendencies, having taken over the media, using the media as a propaganda arm of the state, and also digging in on what he says is widespread corruption. And that message has really taken hold in Hungary, and this new party, which this new challenger formed only a few weeks ago, seems to be poised to gain around 20 to 25% of votes in this next election.
Justin Spike in Budapest, thank you for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing. Finally, on today's show, we will have a wrap of the latest film and TV news with the film critic Ashanti Omkar. Welcome back to the show. We will start at the Cannes Film Festival. What has been making the headlines in week one?
Wow, apart from the red carpet that's literally glittering with stars from all around the world, and of course those fantastic standing ovations. I mean, people have been standing up for 10 minutes and clapping, or 6 minutes and clapping, as they did for Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. This one is very interesting. It'll be premiering in London tonight, and their premiere there with Australian film director George Miller. You know, he directed the first Mad Max in 1979, and he's been kind of rebooting this in such a big way. The last one in this series already had a whole slew of wins at the Oscars, and here it is. It also premiered in Cannes. That was 9 years ago, so it's quite a long time ago with Fury Road, and now here we are with Furiosa, where it's the younger version, so it's a prequel. And Anya Taylor-Joy, who was in The Menu, and Chris Hemsworth, famous as Thor in the Avengers, they are definitely making waves at the moment. We also have Greek filmmaker Yorgos Lanthimos with Kinds of Kindness. This one is very exciting. It will be showing today at Cannes, so everyone is setting up for that. And of course, it's like a spiritual follow-up almost to the buzzy Poor Things, with Emma Stone in the lead. So this is very, very, very exciting. And also The Apprentice, I should say, Danish-Iranian Ali Abbasi has made this film. Sebastian Stan, who was in I, Tonya. This one is him as a young Donald Trump, seeing his early career, understanding how Trump has been so possessed with power, corruption, and deception. So very, very interesting films at Cannes this year.
I mean, that one in particular, I know it premieres on Monday, but do we get any idea ahead of its release about what there still is to tell us about Donald Trump that we don't already know or couldn't have guessed?
Well, I guess part of it is to give us a fictionalized version of what this man could have been, what has driven him to become what he has become now today. And he's obviously one of the most talked about men in the world. So it makes sense that they're trying to look at different parts of his life and give us little slices.
Well, let's take a look at what's on Netflix, specifically a new season of Bridgerton.
Oh, yes. Gosh. It is trending big time at the moment. It has gone berserk on all socials, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, because obviously Bridgerton has built up an IP. The intellectual property for this is incredible. You know, it came out in the pandemic as first season. Some 80 million people watched it around the world. And then they started unleashing a series. And this is like those old Mills and Boons books, but they've given it a contemporary twist, even though it is set in the 19th century, which is very interesting. You see couples of different colors in the Regency area, in the Regency era, I should say, dressed up. It's a costume drama, and they have given it such a sheen, as Shondaland often does.
I mean, I can see them using your gosh there as just the quote on the posters. Gosh, Ashanti Omkar. That'll look fantastic above 4 stars. And finally, and just briefly, we should talk about Tiger Stripes, a new horror film.
Oh gosh, yes. This is definitely one of the best horror films. I presume it'll be one of the best horrors of 2024. It is actually a very interesting look at a Malaysian, this is we don't get to see a Malaysian teenager. And this one has Amanda Nello. She has a grandmother who's English, so she lives in England now, but she grew up in Malaysia till the age of 11, and she has really looked into the superstitions that surround puberty for young women. I have to say, I've been through this myself as a South Asian, and as an Asian, there are lots of things around young women who are reaching puberty, and we really get a deep delve and dive into this. But in this case, you also get a monster that you didn't see coming. And let's just say this teamed with schoolgirl bullying just makes for very compelling viewing.
Ashanti Omkar, thank you very much for joining us. That is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Paige Reynolds. Our researcher was George Ruskin and our studio manager was Steph Chungu. The Briefing returns on Monday at the same time. I'm Andrew Muller. I'm back with The Daily at 1800 London. Thanks for listening.